can't get the void work. Try to build, you know how in the last class with the adaptive component, instead of making it solid, I built up the shape of the faces.
Okay.
You know, you might try kind of building it up that way, making a void.
Working around it.
Yeah, but I'll check out, see what's going on. Sometimes the void, it just needs to make sure it can cut through something.
Okay.
Jeremy, do we get our files today? Starting?
No.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I don't think it might matter.
I mean, I'd like to look at what you've uploaded, but for class, we don't necessarily need it. Before we get started, you might have noticed a few changes on the class website. One of them is I lumped in computational practice onto the class website as well, because I'm teaching some of the labs in the morning. And they're going to also be, those lab sessions will be posted here, so you guys actually have access to those labs as well, just in case you want some extra things to do. But if you just want to deal with BIM methods, under the BIM methods section under the classes, that's where I moved the resources downloads, which is basically our download page. So that's where I moved all the files that we've been downloading prior to class. So for today, you really only need the rendering tutorial file, but I've also provided this other bridge tutorial file just to show you some of the examples that I'm going to show you here at the very start. Both of these files, the render tutorial is probably like a 40 meg file, and then the other one is more like 80. So you might want to start downloading the 40 meg one first, and then run that in the background as I just kind of talk about a couple of these images. For the next part of the semester, I also have under resources, I added a family downloads button. That will basically be another section where we're going to be eventually downloading kind of what I'm going to call my approved family components that we're going to use in our models. So we'll all be using ones that I know will work, but that'll be for starting on Thursday. You guys all got my email. Essentially, it looks like everyone's kind of wrapping up things this week, and we really, because of the couple days that the one day that I was in Colorado and another sick day, we're kind of behind a little bit, by one of the classes. I already planned for one class at least to be missed because of the Colorado trip. So basically what we're going to be doing is completing this part of the project by printing out two 24 by 36 pages that will have your presentation on it. And I've reserved for next week the wall space that's out by the library, kind of all in that entire area. And I'm hoping we can just all pin up all of our work and display it there, just so that not only you guys can see the work, but then also everyone else who's kind of walking by on their way to studio can also check it out. We might go down there just for a quick show and tell, just so you guys can see what others have done. So if you can, if you're downloading those files, that'd be great. I'm going to open up that same one of these files here.
You're trying to tell me it's going to take like an hour to download.
Yeah.
Which one's an hour? The first one?
Bridge tutorial. It's like,
yeah.
Well, it's slowly going down.
Yeah, forget about the bridge tutorial. Make sure you just get the render one. But for the first half of class, or at least first 15 minutes or so, you won't really need to do anything but watch what's on the screen. Today, basically I want to go over how we get an image like this, or any of these other images out of your models that you've been working on. You've constantly been looking at your view in Revit. It's kind of these cartoony looking 3D models at the moment because of the rendering of just maneuvering around in an image. But at some point, we can take camera views of our particular models and then use various render settings to get our different images. The way that Revit works with rendering is pretty similar to 3D Studio Max and even Rhino V-Ray, if you guys have used either of those. If you haven't, that's okay. Basically, under the View setting in the tool ribbon, as long as you are in a 3D view, so I've got these 3D views that are set up, so that by default, we've all been working with the 3D view that's in the parentheses. And then there's the ability to set up all of these additional 3D views, which I'll go over camera placement and so on. But we can get different camera views of looking at our 3D project. And once we're in that view, this render button is supposed to, there we go. This render button, which has always been grayed out, will actually highlight so that you can actually select the render button and begin some various renderings that basically right out of Revit, kind of the out-of-box materials that are applied, and then also just the typical render settings are pretty straightforward and actually kind of quick and easy. Unlike V-Ray and some of these other rendering engines where you really have to set up the lighting and do all this stuff with the textures and get the textures mapped correctly, and you spend probably a good day just setting up all of that information. Kind of the stuff that's right out of the box, right out of Revit, gets applied pretty nicely, and you can get some really nice images that are actually pretty high quality. These images that are under renderings, when I click on these, they're various sizes, and they're 150 DPI, pretty much what we need for printing. And all of these are these images that are saved, and each one of these renderings probably took no more than an hour, just using Revit as the rendering engine. And Revit does not have distributed rendering, so unlike V-Ray and 3D Studio Max, where you can link up more than one computer to speed up the rendering time, right now we can only use the one computer and render the image. And so this 1 hour rendering could have taken probably a lot less if they would start to implement distributed rendering into the system. So hopefully that's coming soon. But for an image like this, at the size that it is, an hour rendering really isn't that bad. So I'm actually kind of pleased with the results. And actually these will actually probably go a lot quicker using these computers up here. The sky that's in the background is a sky that's generated by the rendering engine. So essentially, depending on different settings that we apply to the render, you can get various cloud formations, and you can even see if you're looking at this one particular view, I've kind of got a dusk, kind of almost like a sunset or a sunrise happening off in the distance. You got the kind of the orange haze in the background, which is actually kind of nice. So let me just go over materials and then setting up views. We'll set up views once you guys actually get that file downloaded. Everyone's still downloading files, or okay? All right, so we'll just kind of pay attention to the screen here for a second. So in order to actually set up a 3D view, or set up any kind of rendering, essentially you need 3 components. The first component is you need materials applied to your objects and your different modeling components. You then need a sunlight system, so some kind of light source, whether it's a sunlight system or even interior lights. And then you need a camera view that is set up that will show the perspective view that you're going to render. So with those three items, the first thing I want to talk about is materials. If I click on my bridge that's actually applied in here, been set into this project environment, you can only render in the project environment. So if you're in like a family environment, you won't ever get that render key. So, but in order to apply materials, we can apply materials either in the family environment and then also in the project environment. First thing I'm going to do is I've clicked on my bridge and I'm going to click on Edit Family just so I open that up. And we'll go over how to apply some materials. So in our bridge file, you guys have been working on your canopy structures with your curtain wall or curtain panel components. You have your adaptive components that are probably your tectonic structural systems. You also have your bridge path, which is a, basically a conceptual mass. So you have these three elements. You have the conceptual mass, your curtain panel, and your adaptive component. Each of these can have materials applied by, if you select, let's say I select this bridge path, you'll notice that pretty much everything that you can select when you look at the properties section of your dialog box, under materials and finishes, there's usually a material, and then this is blanked out and it'll say by category or something like that, because there's not a material that's applied. Or you also have this equal button that I've also associated some parameters to materials. I'm going to click on none for a second. One of the simplest ways of applying materials to any element that's in your Revit project is clicking onto the material, and once you click this white space, you get this additional button with the three dots. When we click on that, we get our dialog box that pops up that talks about the materials, and this is where we have experimented a little bit with just changing, the color of the element, of how it appears in the consistent settings. Also, when you're in a project environment, remember you also have a whole nother set of materials other than what we see here. Right now, we only have a few that are kind of our defaults, and then some phases and maybe glass that's applied here. But the way that you apply materials in Revit is essentially this box to the left, all the different materials that you could assign to whatever you've just selected. So I've selected that conceptual mass, I clicked on the button, I'm now in this dialog box, and I can now assign a particular material. I could call it a default wall, and this image that's up to the top right, this is what that material is going to look like when it renders. You guys have only seen usually the color when it's applied, with your consistent color settings and so on and so forth down at the bottom. But this image that shows up to the top right is what this material is going to look like when it's actually, when you run it through the rendering engine. And for some reason, why is glass not changing? So it should update. Some of these are updating, others aren't. So basically what you can do is you can take one of these materials that are already set on the left, and down at the bottom you have a duplicate. If you click on duplicate, you can create a new name for a material. So I can just call this test for now. And again, this is only going to basically just create a new name for a material, but it hasn't really created anything new off to the right. Off to the right, you have these different settings. You have shading, surface pattern, and cut pattern. We've gone over before, the cut pattern is basically the cross hatch or any kind of hatching that you're going to see when you cut through a section marker through any of these objects. Your surface pattern is what you're going to see when you're in elevation. And then under the Appearance tab, this is what you're going to see in all the different settings for making your actual material. You'll see you have under Appearance, you have an Autodesk library that is basically a shared library between Autodesk 3D Studio Max and Autodesk Revit Architecture. Just Autodesk Revit Architecture. Off to the left, we have the library and different templates and different materials that we can pick. So right now, I've got kind of this default material that's being applied to this particular test element. I could come in here and click on metallic paint. And as soon as I click on one of these items in the library, you get another pull-down box that has these kind of globes, or they'll have other items every now and then, maybe like a sphere or a cylinder or something like that. Well, you have some kind of element that is showing you a particular render quality of a material. So under metallic paint, I could go ahead and select glazed fire brick. As soon as I select that, it puts this material up in a property set. This property set that's up at the top is basically saying you are loading this particular texture or this particular material into this Revit environment at this particular moment. So basically this library isn't loaded into every file, it's just kind of referenced from a location somewhere on the C drive. Once you click on it and apply it to a property set, you're actually making this material available in this Revit file, which means if you were to take this Revit file somewhere else, let's say on a computer that maybe didn't have the shared Autodesk library, this material is coming with it and is part of that Revit file. So you probably have experienced within V-Ray and Rhino and even 3D Studio Max, like sometimes you have to make sure you bring all your textures with you. In Revit, you don't really have to worry about that. You just have to worry that you've actually loaded that material into this particular model or this particular file. So once I select that metallic paint glazed fire brick, off to the right under Appearance, it'll show you the metallic paint, what it's going to look like when you hit the render button. And then there are these additional options. So by default, this particular material has this color assigned to it, this RGB value. If you don't like that color, you could come in here and say edit color and pick something else. Let's say you want to define a new property, some kind of color that's not offered. You can also come in here and apply these other settings that might not necessarily be checked at the moment, but you can play around with your different coats. So there's like a top coat, different flex that you can put in here. I'm not going to go into all those settings at the moment, but just the fact that at any moment you could come in here and change, let's say you want a roofing. So you get these kind of cubes and then different roofing patterns. Notice when I click on like one of these items such as the shingles, I now have another set of options off to the far right that weren't associated with the glazed or the glazed fire brick properties. This, depending on the template that you choose under this Autodesk library, it has a set of predefined conditions or properties that would be assigned to this particular render texture. So under roofing or some of these stucco or other items that aren't kind of paint items, you can see you have additional items here that talk about generic images. So like a bitmap image that you can load. You also have self-illumination. You also have bump maps. How many of you have some rendering experience with other programs? Pretty much everybody. So that's good. So you know what I'm talking about when I talk about bump maps and talk about textures. That basically you're referencing an image in this particular generic set is the actual image that you're going to see when it renders. And then there's a black and white version. This probably isn't a good example. Let me pick this one that's actually red. So this is the image that's going to render. But under the bump map, you know, you actually have a black and white image that's providing some sort of relief when the image or the render button is chosen. You can make your own textures, but the best way to do that is to start with an existing one of these properties, and then you can make a new material, and then you could assign a new image to it. So at any moment you could come in here to this image, and let's say for some reason in this Autodesk library you don't have some textures or images that you typically use from, let's say, SketchUp or V-Ray. You could load up within here in this dialog box the actual image by clicking on source, and you notice when I hover over this text, I then get my browse to, and then you can browse to the exact image that you want to find and apply it that way. So I'm not going to go into all of those because I think in this Autodesk library there are a good set of materials that you can find and use, especially for what we're doing in this particular modeling environment. I'm actually really just looking for maybe a few materials actually being applied to your models. I don't want you guys to get too crazy with, you know, trying to find wood flooring and, you know, concrete textures or whatever you want. You can experiment with that a little bit, but in general, I've just really made a white model that I've set in this desert setting with some water. And with that, you know, you get some pretty nice renderings where we're really concentrating on the shadow, the space that, the spatial conditions that your bridge is forming. And then also you get some nice reflections with water. This is just right out of the box. Remember, we applied water as a material in our Revit environment. This is just the material as it gets rendered. It's already, that's that predefined water. And you can see when you get pretty close to it, in this image, you probably can't see it as well up here because it's kind of dark, but you actually get these really nice ripple patterns and some reflections within that material. And you can actually see some of my structures underwater, so I kind of have this blue structure that's within there. So the one method, like I said, was to choose your material in this manner. But one of the things about actually defining all your materials within the family environment is that every time you want to edit that family, so for instance, right now I was trying to edit the actual mass, this actual conceptual mass, which is the bridge path. But if I want to edit this adaptive component and add a material, I actually have to go into this family environment and also apply materials into that as well. But you could actually set up parameters that are materials that can be defined later. So remember, we've been dealing with instant parameters, right? So instance parameters are something that we can set as a default, and when you finally load it into the project environment, you then are able to edit that object or those objects further in the project environment by your instance parameter. So what I've actually done, and if you've been using any of my adaptive components or whatever through examples, you will notice that when you click on family types, and in this dialog box, there's actually under materials and finishes, there's a material structure parameter that is actually here, and it's set to default. That wasn't there originally, so a lot of your example files that you've been working with might not have this particular parameter. To add one, all you have to do is go into parameters and click on add. And so I could call this, I'll just call this material test for right now. And under type of parameter, just make sure it's set to material. And then I'm going to make this selected to an instance. This way I can edit this in the project environment. And one reason to do this would be, remember, when we're in that family environment, there was like, what, 10 materials that were available? But if you remember, when we were in that project environment, there was a whole array of materials that were very detailed and went anywhere from, you know, asphalt shingles down to stucco to brick and so on. you have a lot more choices in the project environment that you don't have to search for through the Autodesk library and actually try to load in and do all those different settings that we just worked on. So that's one reason to kind of set it up this way, is where we can just access that nice library that's already built into the project environment. So I've got my material test name. I have type of material is, or type of parameter is set to material, and this is set to instance. When I hit OK, I now have this additional material that's in the parameter setting. When I hit OK, that's not going to be set to anything. It's not going to change your actual adaptive component or whatever component you're trying to model or change the material in until you select that item. So I'm going to actually just select all of these, turn on my filter just so I'm making sure I'm just getting the different parts. And you'll notice under materials and finishes, this is an item that you always have available in the properties dialog box. But normally it has that button here where we could choose, pop up that dialog box that I was just showing you. But there's an additional button off to the right that allows you to now access a parameter. So after clicking on that material, just like we've done in the past where you can assign a z-axis or a z measurement or some kind of angle, you can click on these buttons. And since we've set up these parameters that are dealing with the material, I could then say that, all of these different 3D objects are going to be set to have the material set to material test. And I hit OK. And then when I load that into the project, so I can load this into, if I just move it into this family file, I'll then be able to click on that adaptive component and then select my material within the next file. So remember, this is kind of like a nested family in the next file. And now that I have this adaptive component, I now have where I can set the material test. And I could say that this is going to be my metallic paint. I didn't save that in here, so I'll set this to plastic white for now, which is a setting I already had. And now my material test, which defines that particular adaptive component, will be set to plastic white, which was defined in this setting. I could go a step further, and because I have all these components, as I could also then set this to a material that's within this final composite model. Because remember, when you do the nested families, that instance parameter tends to only travel one family at a time. And so since I've set this material test in this adaptive component to equal to this setting, I might have another setting within this composite model, which is my, where I built my bridge before I brought it into the project environment. I've set these additional materials, within here that I can then assign material test to make sure that that equals, let's just say, material structure. And so when this loads into your final destination, which is always the RVT project environment, you will have the ability to edit that material further. So there's a couple of steps there just to get that set up, but again, what that allows you to do is you can either decide, do you want to set up all of that information and have it eventually end up in this final model that you can do all the material setting to? Or do you want to, every time you want to change a material, you have to go back in and load up each component and change the material there and then load it into the final project again? So you guys kind of decide how you want to work, but I find that it's a lot more convenient if you can just get it all set up in the final destination where you're actually setting up your camera views, that this is where you can just apply all of your materials at that point. I'm going to let this generate for a second, and then we're going to load up. Does everyone have their file downloaded? Okay, go ahead and open up that render tutorial, and it's going to be a similar scene, but I basically put in some very simple objects so we don't spend an hour trying to render something. You should see two spheres and a pyramid floating through the water on the site. I'm going to exit or close out of this real quick. Might as well save that. Your final file will probably should be somewhere around 40 to 80 megs probably. Just so you know, basically I brought in more topography in this model so I could get some better renderings, and so this ended up being like an 80 meg file. Remember, I also sent you an email that I said I tried to do like some nice cool tectonic railings, and I applied it to my bridge, and it turned out really cool. It was making my rendering go over an hour, and then I looked at my file size, and my file size was like 200 megs just for putting in this repetitive curtain wall panel. So if you end up having, you know, I was basically saying don't worry about getting to that level of detail. I'll be happy with your adaptive structures and your curtain panels applied to your canopies. And as far as a walking path, I don't care if someone can fall off, you know, as they're walking across at this moment. You could put a solid wall up, but you know, it kind of defeats the nice purpose of this. So you can just put on signs later on that say, you know, caution, something like that. All right, I'm closing out of this. I thought I already saved all this, and let me close out of here. And let's go ahead and open up, like I said, our file. So you should have a scene that kind of looks like this. If you don't see the masses, here's a word of caution for you. Like your adaptive components and curtain panels will come in, you know, whenever you load up your RVT file. Occasionally you might notice that you don't see your bridge path. Have you ever noticed that? That's because by default, Revit always assumes in the project environment you don't want to see your conceptual ideas, and I wish it would save your settings. But if you ever go to massing and site, whenever you're in a view, you'll see this button off to the far left here called Show Mask by View Settings. If you just click on that little pie shape up there, that will automatically turn on anything that was a conceptual mask that was in your file. You can also, in your visibility graphics, make sure that mass is checked, and that will help. But again, sometimes when you exit out, it wants to turn all that stuff off. So think about that too when every time you set up a new 3D view that we're going to get into right now, setting up our camera views. Whenever you set up a camera view, your masses might by default be turned off, and so you always have to sometimes turn that back on just by the click of this button. So right now you'll see basically we just have our default 3D view with the brackets, which means we can kind of maneuver around and get a nice view of it. But if we actually want to get some perspective views and start getting something where we're walking on the bridge or looking at these objects from the shoreline, we actually have to set up our camera views, kind of like you would in SketchUp and then also Rhino. But one way to set up all of these views is you have to be in a floor plan view. So first of all, I'm going to just go to, let's say, floor plans and site. This is where I can see everything. And you'll notice that I have a sun path diagram already shown. I think I showed you guys at one time, but by default, your sun path is normally turned off. Down at the very bottom, if you're in any kind of view, you can just click on this sun and then say turn sun path on. What this does is it shows you the position of where the sun is. You know, sometimes in these 3D programs you get the azimuth and the altitude and all that kind of stuff, and you don't necessarily know where the sun is relative to your view. This helps you say, okay, well, I definitely know I want shadows, you know, coming off of this way or having the sun at this particular location. To change your sun settings, because I have this sun path diagram, I can actually click on the sun and drag it, and that will change the time of day. I can also click on the blue tab that's associated with either the time, so I could say, you know, this is 10 a.m., or I could pick another time and it'll move the sun. There's also a date, so off to the far right, or should always be on the far right, but maybe it moves around. or it should probably move along the sun path. I could also change the date to something that's more like May 31st. And you'll notice that you get the sun path diagram moves up. And again, looks like the date is always off to the right, but wherever the morning sun is going to rise. You can also click on the sun path diagram or the sun settings down at the bottom and click on sun settings. And a lot of your models will not have a location set at the moment because we haven't really set a particular location of where your model is located on the Earth. But in the sun settings, you should have under the far right corner here, settings where you can change the location. You can actually click on this button and it will pop open if you're connected to the internet, kind of like a Google Map service, where you can find the actual location. So you can type in the physical address under project address. So I could actually say maybe this is going to be in Honolulu, Hawaii. And it should have gone to Honolulu, Hawaii. Maybe I need to hit search. I need to pick one here. So here you go. I picked Honolulu, Hawaii after I chose the options that were in the Google Earth. It went to that particular section of the Earth. I hit OK, and that's now where my sun path diagram and my sun settings are going to be generated from. You can also set this information up because you're in a project environment. If you go under Manage and under Project Information, this is where you can set up at the very beginning. You could say who your client is, your project's status, actually type in an actual address. But under energy settings, you also get what type of building it's going to be. But then also you have this location button where you can also pick exactly where you are. Those two location buttons are defined together. So whether you're in this view dialog box or the sun settings dialog box, if you make one change here to Charlotte, North Carolina, and I change my location to Charlotte, North Carolina, under sun settings, my location also changes. So this is how you can get very specific, and you don't have to really know what the exact coordinates are on the longitude and latitude and so on. With your solar analysis, you also have, right now I have an in-session single day. You can do a one-day solar analysis, or I could do, you could pick your solstice or your equinox and so on. I right now have it set to a single day. I could change it to multi-day, and if I hit OK, I can then drag my sun not only across the sky here, but I can also pick, let's see, go back to my sunset. I guess I need to choose a better time frame. I got only June to June 1st to June 16th. If I actually would go to, let's say, December 31st as my range, you can see I now have the ability to drag the sun along the different days and dates associated with that range of dates that I wanted to analyze. So you guys have probably done a lot of this in Vasari, things like that, but I'll just point that out again. So the next item is we want to be able to set up our, I'm going to turn off my sun path, is actually set up some 3D views that we can render. So if we click on View, and under this little house icon, you have 3D View and you have this pull-down menu. And so far we've just set up like a default 3D view before. Excuse me. We also have a camera that we can set up. Once we click on a camera, you'll notice at the very top here we have, this is going to be a perspective. If you don't check that, you'll end up with kind of this axonometric view, which you kind of get these weird looking images. Make sure you always have perspective set up. Scale is grayed out because, you know, perspective views you can't really scale. You have an offset. It's set by default to like an eye level, typical eye level of a person. And then it has a datum. So basically right now we only have one floor plan, so we have datum 00 as our datum. So right now, when we choose all of those, if we had other levels in our model, so let's say we had level 2 or level 3 or so on, we could actually choose a different datum to place a camera. But right now we're just going to choose the 00, or this datum 0, and you can click on a start point. This is where you want to place the camera. So maybe I want to be right here on this peninsula down at the bottom right, and I left click, and then my next click is the target. Where do I want to look? And you can zoom out and kind of pan around a little bit. And so as soon as I click on that, it's automatically going to open up another view. This is the view that it just made, and you're going to notice that you may or may not have any kind of information in here. That's because if you remember, our model is at 651 feet above 0, you know, or plus or minus around there, and our datum 00 is down at 0. So we just placed that camera 5'6" off of 0, which means we're currently looking underground. We're not really looking at anything. If you highlight the border of this camera view, you will get 3D options or 3D view options to the left under properties. When you scroll down, you can see eye elevation and target elevation. This is where we could come in here and type in something more like 655 feet for the eye elevation, and I'll do the same thing for target. And as soon as you do that, you are actually moving your eye level and your target level up to those elevations. So knowing where your bridge is, you know, remember, you know your start point and your end point, your spot elevations, you should be able to find some kind of elevation reference that you can move your camera to. You can also click on this dialog or this border for this view, and I could go into like an elevation view. So if you just highlight that border as you're in that 3D view, and then click into an elevation like north elevation, your camera and your target will also be shown. So you could actually come into an elevation and manipulate your eye and target elevations by choosing the icons and dragging them up and down. And you'll notice as I did that, my target elevation moved to whatever corresponded to that move in space. If I flip into a floor plan, so I should still have my site view open, I can also further change my camera views. So if I decide that I don't quite want to look at it in this particular way, and maybe I want my camera to move further kind of up this hill or something like that, maybe my target is moving over here, I can sit here and drag all of these different components. Under 3D views, you'll notice that we had a 3D view with brackets. We now have 3D view 1. That is that perspective view, and you can see I moved my camera somewhere where I'm now underground again, so maybe I need to move up a little bit. We can also click on this view and change our boundaries, our clip boundaries. So we can begin to manipulate how much more of the view in the scene that we can see. By default, the camera is giving you that 30 cone of vision, you know, your 30 degrees on either side of your eyeball. And as you begin to drag these out, you're actually kind of distorting the view beyond, because it's kind of taking that camera view of what the camera would normally see, but then it's starting to kind of distort what you're seeing to the left and right. So it's kind of changing that angle a little bit of your view cone of vision. So you'll notice once you have more objects, the more you start to expand these windows, the more distorted your different components might start to look. I'm going to go back into the 3D view, and if we click on one of these objects, I'm just going to click on the pyramid. These were basically pyramids, all these different default items you can actually get to by going to Home, and I did Component, and I loaded a family, and by default, Revit has these architectural masses that you can actually load into a family that you can further, into a project environment that you can further manipulate. But basically these are nice quick objects just to start with on these examples. So that's where those came from. They already had these dimension settings set, so I could actually change the width, height, and depth of a pyramid. But if I click on the pyramid, I also have this mass material. And then if I were to edit that family, under properties, you'll see that this is also how they set up the mass family, is they added a parameter called mass material and set it as an instance parameter. And that's why you can see it in the project environment and you're able to select a material for that item. Because when I click on this part of the pyramid off to the left, it has an equal button and it's equal to mass material. So kind of that latter example of what I talked to you about with your families is exactly how they also set it up. So clicking on the pyramid, let's go ahead and click on mass material. And under materials, it has under here default form. Kind of best practices is to duplicate this and create a new material if you're going to start a new, if you want to make your own material. Or you could scroll through here and find other materials that you might want to use. But I just did duplicate and I've got default form 2. The reason for that is if I start to make changes to, let's say I'm under glass, and I decide to then go under appearance and these property sets and change something from the Autodesk library, that will change everything that was associated with glass. So let's say you already had all these windows and everything set up, and if you start manipulating any kind of material under the glass, under appearance property sets, you're actually globally changing those materials. So that's why it's best practice to, under materials, go ahead and duplicate a view or duplicate a material. I've got default form, and now we can get into our appearance property sets, and I could come in here and let's go ahead and apply kind of a nice metallic paint, probably this glazed fire brick. And let's hit OK. And that change, you'll notice, won't change until you change your view settings from shaded down to realistic. Basically, when you're in this material environment, what you see in the 3D view that you've normally been working in is that you're typically looking at this render appearance, or what's under shading is what you're actually seeing when you're in that 3D view. Let's say you change your appearance of this item and it's this metallic red, and in your modeling graphics you actually want to also see those materials. You could just click on use render appearance for shading, and it will at least find some kind of average of what this color is, so that next time you're in just a shaded view, your triangle is also red. So it kind of gives you just a representation of what this item is going to be before you go into more of a realistic view. So now that we've at least set that one material, if we go back into our 3D view, we can turn on our realistic view and at least get some kind of vantage point of what we're looking at. I've got my sun set up, I have my material that I've placed, and I have my view camera. And so the last thing that we need to do is apply our render settings to this particular scene. Now the first thing is, how do we size our render so that we're, first of all, doing an efficient rendering, You all know about your pixels, right? Your pixel dimensions and your 150 DPI and how big your image needs to be able to plot and be at a nice high quality. I assume everyone knows that by now in their architectural career. But it's not as obvious in Revit exactly how to size everything. You can't really size your image. Like right now, if I were to take this image and click on it, off to the left, or under my size and crop, you get this little button that pops up at the top. This image right now is only 13 inches by 5 inches high. And so when that gets to 150 DPI, we all know that that's going to be, literally we can only print this at 13 inches, 5 inches, 13 inches by 5 inches. If you want this to be a bigger drawing, let's say you want this whole entire thing to print out on a 24 by 36 image, we want to scale, excuse me, this model crop size to a size that we want to render at and what it's going to be at its final printing. So if you click on Scale, Locked Proportions, and I now know I want this to be, let's say, a 24-inch wide drawing. It didn't really do anything except that it changed under my size crop. I now have a drawing that's 24 inches by 10 and a half. How do you know how efficient you need to be for your rendering? One way is to set up your sheet first, size your different views in your layout, and then render your images so that you're not rendering, our requirement is to have two 24 by 36 drawings. You're probably going to want to have multiple views of your project. You might have a very large image, you might have some smaller images that kind of showcase your work. You don't want to render everything at 24 inches by 36 or whatever at that size, because then you're sitting here wasting about an hour or two on each rendering when you could have been rendering something that was more like 6 inches by 10 inches, which is how you plan to use it on your particular presentation board. So what we need to do is, before we continue, so that we're efficient, click under View and you want to click on Sheet. By default, there's usually like an AutoCAD title block that is loaded in here, and on this example I purged it because you don't want Autodesk and all of that nice stuff that they put on their title block. What I would like you to do is select the title block, and you basically need to load in. If you hit in Load and go to Title Blocks, let's pick something that's relatively close to what we're going to use. And I don't know why they don't have 24 by 36 in here, but you got a D22 by 34. Let's go ahead and open that and hit OK. Here's the nice Autodesk default title block. This is a family. If you click on it, you get the Edit Family button. Let's go ahead and click on that. And we're going to select everything except for the outside boundaries and hit Delete. At this point, we're doing a presentation drawing, and we just need a sheet of paper to place things onto, so that you can print to PDF and then print it out so that we can hang it on a wall somewhere. I don't need title block information that says, this is sheet A101 and you have your initials and all that kind of stuff at this moment. This is basically, just like in AutoCAD, this is like paper space. This title block, if you click on it, it will give you a dimension. So you'll see 2'10", and you also see 1'10". Those are the true dimensions of the page. I'm actually going to click on one of these lines, and let's change the height. We'll make this a 24 inch. And then go ahead and click on another line and on the horizontal side, your vertical line, and click on and make that 36 inches. This way we have a 24 inch by 36 inch piece of paper. You could save this as whatever you want to call it. But now that we have our 24-inch by 36-inch piece of paper, we can hit load into project and overwrite this version. It's just like a family that we've normally been working with. And now our sheet, which is down at the very bottom, if you, in your project browser, expand sheets, you have a A102 and it says unnamed. This is just another view in Revit that is just a particular sheet. And I'm not going to worry about what this is called at the moment. Once you have a sheet, what we need to do is start placing our views onto the sheet so that we can lay it out and determine how we want this to look eventually. So what we do is in your project browser, and if you're in the sheet environment, we can take 3D view, left click on it, hold it in, and drag it onto the sheet and let go. And then left click again and you just placed that drawing on that piece of paper. So now I can position this around with my cursor keys. If I decide I want to do some more edits to this sheet, I can right click on it and say activate view. And let's say I want to decide that I want more of my scene to show. Activating a view is like in AutoCAD where you activate a viewport and you go into it. And you can do some, you're basically kind of looking through the paper onto the model space per se. When you're done, you can right click and then say deactivate view, and then you're back into what's kind of considered paper space. So obviously the more views that you have, you can go ahead and set it up exactly how you'd like it to show up on your final printed document. And then you know that when you go back into that 3D view, you have sized this view exactly how you'd like it to appear on this final document. Let's say that I decide I want this view or this image to not be as big as I actually just made it. At any moment you can click on it and say size crop and go back here to this dialog box and you have scale lock proportions. And you can come back here and change your proportions again. So as you start to lay things out, you can decide which one you want to be the larger image and where you're going to get the smaller images and so on and so forth. Now that we've done that, we now have set up this particular 3D view to be exactly the size that we want it to render. So now all we need to do is hit View and Render, and we now get the Render dialog box. Any of you have used V-Ray or 3D Studio Max, you know that your Render dialog box has like a million different settings to click on, and you have to find all the right things that you want to tweak and try to figure out. Right out of the box, the render engine in Revit is pretty straightforward. It doesn't have all those settings to really kind of confuse you. Is everyone at this dialog box? If not, if you click back into your 3D view, make sure you're under the 3D view, click off into the white space somewhere, and then click on Render. You get the Render dialog box. You can't be in your sheet. You can't have to be back in the 3D view section. Then you have a couple different settings for your quality. So obviously you can do some test renders, which are draft, which are going to give you a pretty pixelated image. But let's say you just want to make sure you get the sky correctly or your view to look correct. You can run through a draft rendering. Then you can play with the different other settings. All of these are based on a set of parameters that, let's say if I click on Best or click on Edit, you can see here for settings, all of these preset settings like Best, High, and so on, they have these all these different settings that you cannot edit. But you could come in and make a view specific, so say custom, and you could play around with all these different settings. So this would be kind of like going into V-Ray and trying to find all the correct settings that you need in order to get a nice rendering. But pretty much by default, you don't really need to mess around with that. Just keep in mind that with each level of quality that you go up, you're obviously going to have a longer render time. So if you find that there's sometimes not much difference between a best rendering and a high-level rendering. There might be a little bit of difference between a high and a medium, and there's definitely going to be something between a medium and low, and even a low and draft. So you can decide, maybe do a couple renderings and test it out on like something simple and just look at the quality yourself. I'm gonna, for right now, I'll just pick high. The next setting is output settings. You have resolution, which is the screen. That's gonna render this screen resolution. So whatever your monitor is set to, that's the resolution that it's gonna render at. And it's not gonna be rendering at that nice custom setting that you just sized it, to correctly print onto a screen. If you're doing a screen printing or a screen resolution type of rendering, that's usually good for draft renderings so that you can quickly see what it's going to look like before you spend all the time with the main rendering. But when you want to do your final rendering, you want to click on printer, and then you can see that it gives you that width and height dimension of where you ended up with your size crops. And then you have the ability to change it to a 150 dpi, 300 and 600 dpi setting. So for some reason you're going to be doing some kind of published work that's going to be in a magazine, you might take 600 dpi. But I think you guys here at the print shop, isn't 150 kind of your cutoff? Is that still the case?
I mean, if you could do 300 if it's really nice. We have the printer that can handle 300 now.
So you got 300 now?
Yeah.
Okay, when I was here it was like 150 was pretty, there was really no difference between 150 and 300. So you can play around with, you guys know your print settings a little bit better than I do here. So, in general, I think 150 usually prints pretty well, especially for things that, we're not really going to have a whole lot of detail in our renderings. When you're done, you have a few more settings. You have lighting. So this is where we can say we're only going to have sun only, or you might have, if we're actually placing lights, which we'll get into in our next project, you could actually have interior settings and artificial lighting and so on. We can just keep sun only. Again, it gives you that sun settings option. You can click on this, and this is where you can click on, maybe we should use the in-session lighting. The in-session lighting, that is that setting that you set up under the sun settings dialog box. Or if you didn't set up anything like your particular location of where you're actually at and your exact sun angles, you can do some really quick renderings by just saying, I always want my sun to be shining from the top right or the top left of my image. So you could also just quickly click on some of those, but sometimes, as you all know, when you have sunlight and lighting coming from behind you in a camera on a 3D view, sometimes your renderings can look kind of flat. So anyway, you can play around with those. Also, your ground plane, this is where the shadows are going to be cast. We don't really have to worry about this too much because our datum is basically casting shadows all the way down to datum 00. But if for some reason you wanted to cut the shadows off at level 2, this gives you that ability to do this, or you can just uncheck, and that will just make infinite shadows go as far down as possible. Then after that, you have sky settings. This is those background images like I was showing you, where you can get no clouds, very few clouds, make it very cloudy. You could add in an image. I will tell you right now that most of you know Photoshop, so it's kind of pointless to add in an image, because you can always, I'll show you in a minute here, as soon as you save your image, you essentially can just bring it into Photoshop and quickly bring in a background and then some other items. So I'm going to just click on Sky Cloudy, and then you have another setting here called Clear or Hazy. So you could add some haze and fuzz to the drawing, or additional ways to actually have lighting kind of bounce around in kind of like a fog, or you can just keep it clear. And don't worry about just exposure at the moment. Then just go ahead and click Render. Let's see how quick this might go. So these actually are running pretty quick, which is nice. So yeah, definitely get in here and run all your renderings. You'll probably be done in a couple hours. But you can basically see that because I don't have a lot of complex materiality applied to this model at the moment, I've just kind of used default colors and so on. Like the water and then also the sand that I've got here, you know, pretty much renders pretty quick, and you get that one box that jumps around that's actually rendering. And the first pass is going to do kind of a pixelated image, and then it's going to go back and refine the image. This water and also any kind of transparent or translucent material, the closer you are to it, so if you're like really close, the rendering might take longer because it's going to detail out that water and start to detail a lot more reflections and you know, start showing you the ripple of the water, and it adds in all these other layers of detail. So sometimes the water or some of these other materials might take a little bit of time to render. Let me see how long this takes for a second. When you're done, this dialog box will stay open, okay? Don't ever close that dialog box. When your rendering is done, as soon as you close that dialog box, your rendering goes away. If you just spent an hour rendering and you went ahead and closed this dialog box without doing anything in addition to that, you just lost your rendering. I find that out the hard way. Another item is when you're rendering, you probably know this from most other classes, is go into your windows, turn off your screensaver. Don't make your screensaver pop up, and also make it so that your monitors don't ever shut off. You know, you have those power settings under the control panel, because sometimes this is using pretty much every resource it can from the computer, and as soon as that screensaver comes on, it might lock up your computer, and you might not be able to get this rendering. So you can see this is starting to go pretty quick. It usually takes a little bit of time to get to 50%, and then after that it'll start going around and highlighting all this stuff. Of course, I did pick high resolution here. Looks like some of you have some renderings going already. So the other item here is when you're done, you'll see at the very bottom you have what's grayed out at the moment. It says Save to Project, and then it says Export. When you're done, that dialog box, those two buttons will be highlighted, which means you can save to the project. As soon as you click on Save to Project, it adds a rendering section under your project browser, and then adds that render name. It'll usually call it like 3D View 1_1 or something like that. It'll just name it something slightly different, or it'll also give you the option to rename it. But then you'll basically have an image that's being saved to this location on the project browser. The other option is you can also export this, and you're exporting it to a PNG, a JPEG, or a TIFF. Then you can, you know, take it into Photoshop, do what you want into it, and then you can bring it back and insert it back into Revit by using the Insert Image icon or toolbar. Now I'm going to show you a couple things while this is running in the background. If you, and what I would recommend is that when your rendering is done, you save it to the project, and then you also export it as two file formats. One would be maybe export it as a JPEG. The other would be to export it as a TIFF file. TIFF files are a lot more high resolution and better for printing, but there's a difference of what Revit will do when you do that. When you do it as a JPEG, I'm going to scan through my JPEG images, and you notice I have a sky. I have the sky in the background. That generated sky that was created just by those different settings in the render engine. As a JPEG, you will get the image that you see on the screen. When you export it as an image that has some kind of ability to have transparencies, your TIFF files and your PNG files, I guess I'm opening this in Photoshop, it essentially does not bring the sky with it. It will be a transparent background of anywhere the sky was located, which is kind of a nice feature because you don't have to go around and cut out your model and do all that kind of stuff that sometimes you have to do. And you can immediately bring in your own background image and then further touch this up in Photoshop like you would typically do. So this is on its own layer, and then you can layer things behind it. So that's kind of the nice thing about exporting it as different images, you have that ability, so you don't really have that sky in the background. But just be aware that if you export the TIFF file and then expect that you're going to have the sky, you lose the sky. So you kind of have to play around with how you're going to use that image. Of course, when you're done, this sky image and the rendering that gets saved over here in the project browser, it is actually saving this image that is actually seen here. And hopefully this might end up finishing up here. I probably should have picked like draft rendering for you guys. I always mess up like that.
So Jeremy, these renderings, does that actually use the sky to change kind of how the color presents itself?
Yeah, you'll notice on this, let me go back to the JPEG, this last image, kind of have this like orange haze to it, and you can see in the reflection down here, I've got kind of these orange and reflected items that are kind of generated from the color.
Gotcha.
So it's actually kind of nice to, it's really kind of photorealistic in a way, and you don't even have to worry about trying to set that up, with all the different settings. It's already built in. So if you want to get like a nice sunset shot or some kind of something that would be in the winter time or whatever, you'll get those reflections in the water and then also the shadows.
Did that disappear in the TIFF file, or did this?
Well, in the TIFF file, when you look at it in the Photoshop, it's hard to see, but you can actually still see it in that reflection, but it's just not in there. So you kind of have to probably match up your sky a little bit to what you're going to do in that background image for a little bit. And of course, you can come in here then and add people and do all that nice photo montage stuff that we typically do. All right, we're almost done here with this. See, if I hit cancel, I haven't done this. Maybe someone else can do this. If you hit cancel, does it still display this image?
It stops wherever you stop it.
But does it highlight save the project and export? Okay. So let me just do that. So I can hit cancel and say, do you want to stop this? And basically you can decide to cancel, this, you say this is good enough, I'm going to go with this. I now have my save the project and export. I find the adjust exposure option is pretty much worthless because you can just take your image into Photoshop and do all that and have better filters and all that kind of stuff as well. So I wouldn't worry about that. And you can say save the project. As soon as I do that, I hit OK, and then I get a renderings tab, and then over here. You'll also notice that when I hit export, I have just a few images here, or file types that I can use. So again, here's your JPEG, PNGs, and TIFFs that you can save. So you might want to save your different image formats. Let's say you forget you've already saved your project to the rendering section. I exit out of this, and now if I go back into my 3D view, that image is gone. But because I saved it to the project, I can click on renderings, and there it is. I can further click on this image and then scale it, but you all know that if you render this to a particular size and then you try to blow it up, you're just distorting it and making the quality worse. So of course you could scale it down if you had to. This works just like a regular image, but the one thing I need to show you is that if you go onto your sheet that you just set up, that rendering is not there. Anyone know why? Basically, it's because we just placed under 3D views, we placed that view onto the sheet, but we now have another view called renderings that we didn't place on here. So basically what I'm doing is using the 3D views, placing it on the sheet just to get the size to be efficient for rendering. Then I can take my rendered view and slide it over and put it on the sheet, and if I click on this, I can just hit delete. It didn't delete it from the project, it just deleted it off of the sheet. So then you can move your rendered images around, and that's what you'd eventually print. Let's say you forget to save your image. Let's say you only saved your image to the project browser, but then you decided later on that you really didn't like this guy and you wanted to add in some other additional stuff to this image. You can as long as you have these renderings within the project browser, go into your applications menu and click on export. You can click on images, and we can then export selected views. And if you click on select, you can then pick your rendering and then have that exported at particular formats like a JPEG. It's going to export a TIFF, PNG, or JPEG of that. I haven't tested out to see if when you export that, if the sky still comes with it in that method. I would suspect that because it saved it as an image that would look like it was flattened, that probably the sky would come with it in the TIFF file. That's why I would just recommend with those render dialog box, you just make sure you get all the images you can off of it by saving to the project and then doing all the different exports that you can.
Is there any reason the render one would be a lot smaller when you place it on the sheet?
It could be possible that when you rendered, your quality was set to screen resolution instead of printer. You just might want to double check that. And so it probably rendered it at the screen resolution of whatever these screens are.
If you did something or did temporary hide, will it still render it, or will it render what?
Yeah, so actually if you hide things in the view, if I go to, let's say 3D view, and if I temporarily hide something, nice. Let's just do a quick render. I think if you permanently hide something, I know it definitely doesn't show it. So if you are in your visibility graphics, so it looks like the temporary also hid it as well. So yeah, you can also temporarily hide things, but you can also go into your visibility graphics and turn things on and off. And this is where you also have to make sure that in your visibility graphics, when you're in this 3D view, you also have the mask checked. One of my renderings you can't really see because I was at an angle where you couldn't see the bridge path, but I actually didn't have the bridge path showing up in that view, and I didn't notice it until I went to my next rendering, and it started rendering, and I was halfway done, and I was like, you don't even see my path because I was looking down on it. That's because it was a mask, and I didn't have it shown in that view when I hit the render button. So just be aware of all those visibility settings when you're working on that.
Is there a reason when I set a camera on this, like the things don't show up even if I change the height?
Yeah, one other thing about cameras, before we head out, you also notice you have under properties, like if you're in your 3D view, and down at the far left, where the eye elevation was set, and you had your target elevation, you also have these crop region visible, which would be, if you don't want to see that box, you can go ahead and turn that off. But then you also have a far clip plane, and a lot of you probably have experienced that before, but you can set how far you actually see into the rendering, as far as your objects are concerned. So by default, it's set to somewhere where I set my target position. You could either just uncheck far clip active, and that would just make it infinite, or you could come in here under far clip active and then just give it some number that would go a lot further. So I could change this to like 100 feet, and you'll notice it only shows part of the topography and not anything beyond 100 feet. Yes?
So to kind of set up our own renderings, we will have to go into each component, like the structure, the truss above, and everything else, and set up material, and then bring it in back into the project environment.
Right. Yeah. So you'll basically right now you've set up your your main composite bridge, and it's in the topography somewhere. You're essentially going to be setting all those components up to have materials. sending it back into the project environment and overwriting it. You know, you'll get that dialog box that says overwrite, and you say yes, and then you're able to set up all your materials.
If we have something that we can just be white, can we leave it as a default?
Yeah, you could just leave it as a white. And actually, I'll tell you what I did in my my different settings. If you guys have like one more minute here, I will tell you right now that you could go through and try to find. Let's see, I need my 3D view. You know, essentially, when you're setting up your different materials. You could come in here and try to find a material and hunt through all the different, you know, property sets and, you know, spend hours and hours trying to find something you like. Or I will tell you that it's sometimes pretty easy just to click on, you don't want to do that, the default. So if I click on like default up here at the top, you get this basic gray shading, and you could just come in here and give it a color. That's essentially what I did. Is I just made all of my stuff white, and then I made my sand, my desert look. Let's see if I go under site. And then I just made my sand color. I just took a default, duplicated it, and then gave it an RGB value of 215, 177, and 99. And that, you know, you can do a lot with color sometimes without having to get so fancy with all your different materials. And that's the quickest and down and dirty way to just, you know, get a nice rendering. At least you have the water that's going to give you some nice reflections, and you can go from there. I'll stay and answer any questions and help out. And then I know you have some issues going on.
I still, when I set the view, the forms aren't there.
So under massing and site, click on show mass.
Oh, okay, that's it.
Yeah, so sometimes, I haven't figured out why sometimes it decides to show it and sometimes it doesn't. Yeah. But it likes to turn it off a lot. So that's